They said Vivienne Ashford fired assistants because they couldn't talk to her. She was the ruthless, deaf CEO of a billion-dollar media empire. I was just a desperate applicant who spent 48 hours learning sign language in my bathroom mirror, hoping to survive the interview. But when I accidentally signed the wrong sentence during our meeting, she didn't throw me out. Instead, the Ice Queen of Manhattan did something that completely terrified me. The job listing said executive assistant to the CEO of Ashford Media, but it didn't say the CEO was deaf, and it definitely didn't say she'd fire 3 assistants in 6 months. Grace Miller read that last part on a forum for Manhattan admin professionals 2 days before her interview. The thread was titled, "Ashford Media is a graveyard for executive assistants," and had 47 replies, most of them variations on run. One comment stood out. "Vivienne Ashford doesn't fire you because you're bad at your job. She fires you because you can't talk to her, and she won't give you a second chance to learn." Grace closed her laptop, looked at the stack of bills on her kitchen counter, and made a decision that would change her life in ways she couldn't possibly predict. She spent the next 48 hours doing 3 things: practicing interview answers in the mirror, rehearsing how to look professional in a navy blazer she'd owned since college, and watching YouTube videos on American Sign Language at 2 a.m. with the volume off so her roommate wouldn't wake up. She learned, "Hello? Nice to meet you. Thank you. And I'm sorry. I'm still learning." She learned, "I'm sorry," first. Seemed like the safest bet. The Ashford Media Tower loomed over Bryant Park like a glass monument to corporate ambition. Grace stepped into the lobby at 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes early, and immediately felt underdressed. Everyone around her moved with purpose, carrying coffee cups and tablets, wearing clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. She pressed the elevator button for the 42nd floor and tried to remember how to breathe. The receptionist on the executive floor was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a kind face. She looked at Grace's resume, then at Grace, then back at the resume, and said, "You're aware of the turnover rate for this position?" "Yes, ma'am," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I read about it." "And you still showed up?" "I need the job." Grace paused, then added, "And I think I can do it. I think I can talk to her." The receptionist studied her for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then she nodded once, stood, and gestured for Grace to follow. Vivienne Ashford was all glass and clean lines, with a view of the Manhattan skyline that made Grace's knees feel weak. But it was the woman behind the desk that made her forget to breathe entirely. Vivienne was tall, with dark hair pulled back in a sleek knot and sharp cheekbones that could have been carved by a sculptor. She wore a charcoal suit, with no jewelry except a thin silver watch, and she was reading something on her tablet with an intensity that made Grace feel like she was interrupting a sacred ritual. She didn't look up when Grace entered. The receptionist said, "Ms. Ashford, your 10 o'clock is here. Grace Miller." Vivienne's eyes lifted from the tablet. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they swept over Grace once, quickly, like a scan. Then she set the tablet down, and Grace saw her hands move in a series of quick, precise gestures. The receptionist translated. "Ms. Ashton says you're early. She appreciates punctuality, but she has a call until 10. You can wait in the conference room." Grace's heart was pounding. She'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her apartment, but now that it was real, all her carefully prepared phrases flew out of her head. She took a breath, looked directly at Vivienne, and signed, slowly and imperfectly, "Nice to meet you. I'm Grace. I'm still learning." The room went very quiet. Vivienne's hands stilled on the edge of her desk. Her expression didn't change. It was still that same cool, unreadable mask, but something shifted in her eyes. A flicker. A crack in the ice, barely visible and gone before Grace could be sure she'd seen it. The receptionist looked at Grace with an expression that was hard to read. Surprise, maybe? Or pity? Vivienne signed something back, her movements faster than Grace could follow. The receptionist translated. "Ms. Ashford says she doesn't have time for performances. If you're applying for this job, you'll need to communicate through a professional interpreter. She recommends you use the hour before your interview to review the company handbook." Grace's cheeks burned. She nodded, ducked her head, and followed the receptionist to the conference room, where a thick binder sat on the table next to a bottle of water. She sat down, opened the binder, and stared at the words without reading any of them. She'd signed wrong or too slowly, or maybe she'd signed something offensive without knowing it. She'd only been learning for 2 days, and she'd been so proud of herself for trying, and now she felt like a fool. But there was something else, too. Something in the way Vivienne's hands had stilled, in the flicker of her eyes, something that made Grace think the sign language hadn't been the problem. The problem was that Vivienne didn't know what to do with someone who tried. Grace looked at the window. 42 floors up, the city hummed below her, indifferent and vast. She had no idea, sitting there with her burned cheeks and her bruised pride, that she was about to become the 4th person in 6 months to get this job, and the only one who'd stay. The binder sat open on her lap, but Grace wasn't reading it. She was watching the clock on the conference room wall, a sleek white circle that seemed to mock her with its slow, silent crawl. 42 floors below, the city hummed with a life she couldn't reach from up here. She'd signed wrong, or too slowly, or maybe she'd signed something offensive without knowing it. She'd only been learning for 2 days, and she'd been so proud of herself for trying, and now she felt like a fool. But there was something else, too. Something in the way Vivienne's hand had stilled. In the flicker of her eyes that made Grace think the sign language hadn't been the problem. The problem was that Vivienne didn't know what to do with someone who tried. The door opened, and Grace snapped to attention, half expecting the CEO herself. But it was the receptionist from downstairs, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and a kind, tired face. She carried a small tray with a paper cup of coffee and a wrapped pastry. "Thought you might need this," the woman said, setting the tray down. "Waiting rooms are the worst. I'm Dana, by the way. I work the front desk." Grace blinked. "Thank you, I'm Grace." "I know, I checked you in, remember?" Dana smiled, then glanced at the binder. "You're the one who signed. I saw it on the camera feed in the lobby." Grace's cheeks burned. "Yeah, that was me." "Nobody's done that before," Dana said quietly. "Not in the 6 years I've been here. Ms. Ashford said 3 assistants come and go since March, and not one of them ever tried." Grace looked down at her coffee. She doesn't like it when people try. Dana hesitated, then lowered her voice. She doesn't like it when people pretend. She can tell the difference. She's been deaf since she was 19, and she spent her whole life reading lips and reading people. If you're faking it, she knows. Grace's stomach dropped. "I wasn't faking, She stopped, because she didn't know how to explain the last 2 days of YouTube videos, and flashcards, and signing at herself in the bathroom mirror. "I know you weren't," Dana said. "That's why I'm telling you. She's had people flatter her. People pity her. People use her disability as a talking point in interviews. But no one's ever just tried. Not for real." Grace sat with that for a moment. The coffee was warm in her hands, grounding her. "Why did the other assistants leave?" Dana's face flickered, something careful passing over it. "That's not my story to tell. Just know it wasn't because they couldn't do the work. They were all qualified. They just couldn't get past the wall." "What wall?" "The one Ms. Ashford puts up when she decides someone isn't worth the effort," Dana said. She patted the edge of the table and turned toward the door. "You've got about 40 minutes left. The binder has her communication preferences on page 6. Page 6, not the first 5 pages. Those are just HR fluff." She was gone before Grace could thank her. Grace stared at the binder, then flipped to page 6. It was a single sheet, typed in clean, simple language, as if someone had distilled an entire philosophy into a few lines. Preferred communication, written notes for complex matters, spoken words for simple exchanges, and ASL only with individuals who are fluent. Please do not use improvised or partial sign language in professional settings. It creates misunderstandings. Grace read it twice, then a third time. The words were polite, but they landed like a door closing. She'd been so proud of her 2 days of flashcards, and it turned out the thing she'd offered was the one thing Vivienne explicitly didn't want. She closed the binder and took a sip of the coffee. It was good, strong and black. The kind of coffee you ordered when you weren't trying to impress anyone. She thought about packing up and leaving, about saving herself the humiliation of a proper rejection. But then she thought about the flicker in Vivienne's eyes, that tiny, unguarded moment there and gone before the mask came back down. Grace had seen sainting, thinks taking me. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew it was real. She pulled out her phone and opened the flashcards app. She had 40 minutes left, and she wasn't going to waste them. By the time the conference room door opened again, Grace had reviewed the full alphabet twice and learned 5 new phrases. She looked up, expecting Vivienne. But it was a different woman, younger, with a clipboard and a professional smile. "Ms. Miller, Ms. Ashford will see you now. She's asked that we hold the interview in her office instead of the conference room, and she's requested a certified interpreter to join us via video call." Grace stood, her heart hammering. "Of course, whatever she needs." The woman nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Right this way." Grace followed her down a long hallway, the city sprawling through floor-to-ceiling windows on her left. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stop trying. The office was bigger than her entire apartment. That was Grace's first thought as she stepped inside, and it wasn't a judgment, just a fact. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, and the city hummed below like a distant heartbeat. Vivienne Ashford sat behind a sleek walnut desk, her posture immaculate, her dark hair swept into a low knot. She looked up as Grace entered, and for a moment, the air in the room seemed to shift. On the wall-mounted screen beside the desk, a video call was already connected. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a headset. "Ms. Miller, this is Rachel, our certified interpreter," Vivienne said, her voice clear and practiced. She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please, sit." Grace sat, her palms damp against her thighs. The flashcards she'd reviewed in the hallway. Thok? Suddenly useless, like studying for a math test and walking into a poetry exam. Rachel signed something to Vivienne, and Vivienne nodded. "I'll begin with a straightforward question," Vivienne said, her gaze steady on Grace. "Why do you want this job?" Grace took a breath. She'd rehearsed this answer, but the weight of the room made it feel different. "Because I believe in what your foundation does," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I read about the literacy programs you fund, the after-school initiatives. I've volunteered in similar spaces, and I know the difference they make." Rachel's hands moved, translating her words into fluid, precise signs. Vivienne watched Rachel, not Grace, her face unreadable. Then she asked another question, and another, and Grace answered each one with growing confidence. The rhythm of the interview settled into something almost comfortable, until it wasn't. "Your resume mentions you're learning American Sign Language," Vivienne said, her tone neutral. "Why?" Grace felt the heat rise to her cheeks. This was the question she'd been dreading. "I started learning recently," she admitted. "I know I'm not fluent, but I wanted to be able to communicate with you directly if possible." Rachel translated. Vivienne's expression flickered, something between surprise and skepticism. "That's unusual," she said slowly. "Most candidates don't attempt that." "I'm not most candidates," Grace said, and immediately regretted how it sounded. Too bold, too rehearsed. But Vivienne's lips twitched, the barest hint of something that might have been amusement. "No," Vivienne murmured, almost to herself. "You're not." The interview continued, technical questions about grant writing and community outreach. Grace felt herself relaxing into the rhythm, their initial terror fading. Then, near the end, something unexpected happened. A faint buzzing sound filled the office, and Vivienne's phone vibrated on the desk. She glanced at it, her jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second before she looked back up. "Excuse me," she said, reaching for the phone. But before she could silence it, her gaze caught on something else. The small digital clock on her desk, its red numbers blinking. Her expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a cloud passing over water. Grace didn't know what the buzzing was, or what the clock meant, but she noticed something else. She noticed the way Vivienne's shoulders tensed, the way her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her desk. She noticed the professional mask slip, just a fraction, revealing something underneath that looked like exhaustion. And then, without thinking, Grace signed something. It was clumsy, a phrase she'd learned only that morning from a YouTube tutorial, and she wasn't even sure she got it right. but she did it anyway. "Are you okay?" The room went still. Rachel's hands paused mid-translation, her eyes widening slightly. Vivienne stared at Grace, her face unreadable, and for a long moment, nobody moved. "You're asking me if I'm okay," Vivienne said finally, her voice quiet. She wasn't signing, but she didn't need to. Her lips formed the words clearly, and her eyes, for the first time, held something other than professional distance. Grace nodded, her heart pounding. "I just noticed you seem busy. I didn't mean to overstep." Vivienne's lips parted, then closed. She looked away, toward the window, and when she looked back, the mask was in place again. But not quite. There was a crack in it now, hairline thin but visible. "That's not a phrase you'd learn from a basic ASL course," Vivienne said. "Where did you pick it up?" Grace swallowed. "I found a YouTube channel. It's for beginners, but they have some practical phrases. I've been practicing every day for 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Vivienne repeated the words slowly, as if tasting them. "And you learned how to ask that?" "It seemed important," Grace said simply. "I figured if I was going to do this, I should learn the things people actually say, not just the alphabet." Rachel was watching the exchange with barely concealed interest, her hands resting in her lap. Vivienne was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Grace in a way that felt both intense and strangely vulnerable. "Ms. Miller," she said finally, her voice softer than before, "I have interviewed 47 candidates for this position. Not one of them has ever asked me if I was okay." Grace didn't know what to say to that, so she said the only thing that felt true. "Maybe they were too nervous." "Maybe," Vivienne agreed, but her eyes said something else. Something Grace couldn't quite read. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and the interview was over. "I have one more meeting," Vivienne said, "but I'll have my assistant reach out with a decision by Friday." Grace stood, her legs slightly shaky. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Ashford. I really appreciate the opportunity." Vivienne nodded. "Rachel, thank you as well." The interpreter waved on the screen before the call disconnected. As Grace turned to leave, Vivienne's voice stopped her. "Ms. Miller?" Grace turned back. Vivienne was standing by the window, the city sprawling behind her, and for just a moment she looked less like the formidable CEO and more like someone who hadn't been asked a kind question in a very long time. "The phrase you think," Vivienne said. "You got the verb order wrong." Grace blinked. "I did? You signed you okay are instead of are you okay?" Vivienne's lips curved, the faintest ghost of a smile. "But I understood you anyway." She turned back to the window, and Grace knew she was dismissed. She walked out of the office, down the hallway, past the glittering city views, her heart beating a wild rhythm in her chest. She had gotten the verb order wrong, but Vivienne had understood her anyway, and for the first time since this whole terrifying, beautiful journey began, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Grace didn't remember the subway ride home. She floated through the turnstile, rode the downtown train with her forehead pressed against the cool window, and only surfaced when she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her shared apartment in Astoria. The door swung open before she could find her keys. Nora stood there in her pajamas, a bowl of cereal in one hand, her eyebrows already raised. "Well?" Nora asked. "Did the Ice Queen thaw, or did she freeze you on the spot?" Grace dropped her bag by the door and fell onto the worn couch. "She corrected my sign language." "That's not an answer." "She said she understood me anyway." Grace pressed her palms to her warm cheeks. "And she told me I was the only one out of 47 candidates who asked if she was okay." Nora lowered the cereal bowl slowly. "You asked the CEO of a billion-dollar company if she was okay? In sign language?" "With the wrong verb order." For a long moment, Nora just stared at her. Then she set the bowl down, crossed the room, and sat on the coffee table directly in front of Grace. "Okay," Nora said softly. "I'm going to need you to start from the beginning." The story came out, I think, pieces. The glass door, the city view, the way Vivienne's shoulders had dropped for just a second, when she thought no one was looking. The phone that buzzed and the clock that made her jaw tighten, and the hand sign that had come out of Grace's mouth before her brain could stop it. "You've only been practicing for 3 weeks," Nora said. "You signed a full sentence to the most intimidating woman in Manhattan?" "It wasn't a full sentence. I got the verb wrong." "Grace." Nora's voice was gentle now. "That's not the point. The point is you did it. You actually did it." They sat in silence for a moment. The radiator clanked in the corner, and somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed. The apartment smelled like Nora's lavender candle and the leftover takeout from 2 nights ago. "I think she's lonely," Grace said quietly. "I know that sounds stupid. She's rich and powerful and beautiful, and she probably has 100 people who want to be her friend. But when I signed that question, her face did something, like she hadn't been asked that in a really long time." Nora picked her cereal bowl back up. "You're not going to be able to let this go, are you?" "I don't want to let it go." "Then don't." Nora pointed her spoon at Grace. "But if she doesn't call you by Friday, you're coming to trivia night with me, and you're going to let me set you up with that cute barista who's been making eyes at you for a month." Grace laughed. It came out softer than she expected. "Deal." That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her phone sat on the nightstand, dark and silent. She'd already checked it 14 times since getting home. The screen lit up now, and her heart lurched, but it was just a notification from the weather app. She rolled onto her side and pulled up the two-chain candle she'd been using to practice. ASL with Marisol. She'd found it 6 weeks ago, after the first time she'd seen the job posting. The video was titled, "Common Phrases You'll Actually Use," and she'd watched it so many times she could recite Marisol's warm voice in her sleep. She scrolled to the comment section. There was a new reply on her comment from 2 weeks ago. She'd asked about the difference between "Are you okay?" and "You okay?" are in casual signing. The reply was from Marisol herself. "Great question. In ASL we use topic, comment structure. So you'll often see the topic first. But for urgent emotional check-ins, the raised eyebrows and facial expression do a lot of the work. Keep practicing." Grace smiled. She typed out a thank you, then paused. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She wanted to tell someone what had happened today. But the only person she wanted to tell was the one person she wasn't supposed to contact. She set the phone down and closed her eyes. Across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked the exact same skyline Grace had admired from the 41st floor, Vivienne Ashford sat alone in her living room. The lights were dimmed. A glass of wine sat untouched on the marble table beside her. She had the YouTube app open on her tablet. The video was titled, "Common Phrases You'll Actually Use," and the woman in the thumbnail was smiling warmly at the camera. Vivienne had watched it 3 times. She was practicing the ham shapes in her lap, her movements still slightly stiff from disuse. She hadn't signed regularly in years. Not since. She closed her eyes. The phone that had buzzed during the interview sat on the table face down. She opened her eyes, looked at the video again, and pressed play for the 4th time. The young woman on the screen began to sign, her movements fluid and bright, and Vivienne followed along, her lips moving silently with the words. She practiced until her hands ached. She practiced because a girl with wrong verb order and warm brown eyes had asked her if she was okay, and Vivienne couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her that. She practiced because she wanted to be ready if Grace asked again. The call came on Thursday afternoon, not Friday. Grace was standing in her kitchen, spoon halfway to her mouth, yogurt dripping back into the bowl as she stared at the screen. The caller 499 read Ashford Media. She let it ring twice, 3 times, her heart hammering so loud she almost missed the 4th. She answered. "Hello? Grace Miller?" The voice was not Vivienne's. It was a woman's voice, brisk and efficient. "This is Dana Whitfield, Mr. Ashford's executive assistant. She'd like to see you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Does that work?" Grace's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Tomorrow? But the interview was only—" She stopped herself. "Yes, 9 o'clock works. I'll be there." "Great, I'll send the address. The same floor as before?" The line went dead. Grace lowered the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She looked at Nora, who was standing in the doorway with a coffee mug, eyebrows raised. "Well?" Nora said. She wants to see me again. Tomorrow morning? Nora grinned. That's a good sign, right? They don't do follow-ups with people they're not interested in. Grace nodded slowly, but something else was nagging at her. Dana had said, Mr. Ashford, not Ms. Vivienne Ashford. She'd never actually caught Vivienne's full name during the interview, and the thought of having gotten it wrong all this time made her stomach flip. How many times had she find Miss Ashford and meant the wrong person entirely? She spent the rest of the afternoon rehearsing not just her sign language, though she did run through the greetings again, twice, 3 times, but the conversation itself. What if Vivienne asked her about her experience again? What if she asked why Grace had asked if she was okay? What if she didn't ask anything at all, and they just sat there in silence? The last thought was the worst, because Grace couldn't shake the feeling that the question had mattered. That Vivienne had heard it differently than she'd intended, that it had landed somewhere unexpected and uncomfortable. At 9 the next morning, Grace stood in front of the same glass doors, her palms sweating inside her jacket pockets. Dana met her in the lobby and led her down the same hallway, past the same quiet cubicles, to the same corner office. But this time, the door was open. Vivienne was standing at the window, her back to the door. She was wearing a deep navy blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a low twist. When she turned, Grace saw that the sharp, guarded expression from the first interview was gone. In its place was something quieter, something almost tentative. Ms. Miller, Vivienne said. Her voice was softer than Grace remembered. Thank you for coming back. Grace stepped inside. Thank you for asking me. There was a pause. Vivienne gestured to the chair across from her desk, and Grace sat down. The office looked the same, the books, the city skyline, the neat stacks of paper, but the energy was different, less like an interview, more like a conversation. Vivienne sat down across from her. She folded her hands on the desk, then unfolded them. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was careful, measured, like C.R. Merpog booings. He was choosing each word by hand. I want to apologize, Vivienne said. For the last interview, I was distracted. It was unprofessional of me. Grace blinked. You don't need to apologize. You were fine. No, I wasn't. Vivienne looked down at her hands, then back up. And I want to thank you for asking if I was okay. No one has asked me that in a long time. Grace's chest tightened. She'd rehearsed so many things for this meeting, but not this. Not Vivienne Ashford, the woman who ran a media empire, sitting across from her and saying thank you for caring. I meant it, Grace said. And then, because she didn't know how else to say it, she raised her hands and signed, slowly and carefully. You matter. Vivienne's breath caught. She stared at Grace's hands, her eyes unreadable. Then, very slowly, she raised her own hands. Her movements were stiff, unpracticed, but Grace recognized the shapes instantly. Thank you, Vivienne signed. Then hesitantly, you too. Grace's heart ached. She'd seen Vivienne's file, her titles, her accomplishments, but this fumbling, clumsy attempt at communication from a woman who spoke perfectly, who commanded rooms with a single glance, this was the most vulnerable thing Grace had ever witnessed. Your sign language is good, Grace said aloud, then signed the same words, slower. Vivienne's lips curved into something almost like a smile. It's a seeing. She'd wondered, in the quiet hours of the night, what had made Vivienne's hand shapes so hesitant, so careful. She hadn't expected this. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Vivienne shook her head as if to dismiss the weight of it. It's okay. It's just, you made me want to remember it. The way you asked about me, the way you kept trying even when you got the verb order wrong. A pause. That meant something. Grace swallowed. It wasn't hard. You're worth the effort. The words came out before she could stop them. She felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't take them back. Vivienne was looking at her with an expression Grace couldn't quite name. Not surprised, exactly. More like she was seeing Grace for the first time. Ms. Miller, Vivienne said slowly, I'd like to offer you the position. Not because I feel obligated, but because I think you're exactly what this office needs. Grace's breath caught. You're hiring me? I'm hiring you. Vivienne's voice was warm, almost gentle. But I want you to know, I'm not offering this because of the sign language. I'm offering it because you saw me. Not the title, not the company. Me. That's not something I find every day. Grace didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded, and Vivienne nodded back. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that felt like a conversation of its own. Thank you, Grace finally managed. Vivienne smiled, and it was like watching ice break on a river in early spring. Slow, quiet, but unmistakably real. Welcome to Ashford Media, Grace. The first week at Ashford Media felt like learning to breathe underwater. Grace arrived early every morning, made coffee for the team, and memorized the workflow with the quiet determination of someone who knew she had something to prove. She didn't mind the small talk in the break room, or the way the receptionist, Brenda, always asked about her weekend. What she minded was the way conversations stopped when she walked past certain desks. It started on Tuesday. She was heading to the printer when she heard two voices behind the filing cabinet. That's the one who got hired because she learned sign language for the interview. Really? That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most calculated. Calculated, definitely. You don't learn sign language overnight unless you want something. Grace's cheeks burned. She stood frozen, the print job forgotten, until the voices faded into the click of heels and the low hum of the office. She told herself it didn't matter. People gossiped. That was just office culture. But the words followed her through the afternoon like a stray dog she couldn't shake. She didn't tell Vivienne. She didn't think she needed to. But by Thursday, the whispers had grown teeth. It was Dana, of all people, who pulled her aside near the end of the day. The executive assistant's face was unreadable, but her voice was quiet and careful, like she was delivering news she'd rather not give. Grace, can I give you some advice? Sure. People here talk. They always have. But there's a rumor going around that you're not here for the job. Dana paused, adjusting the strap of her bag. That you're here for her. Grace's stomach dropped. That's not... I know. I'm just telling you what's being said. Vivienne doesn't listen to gossip, but she notices when her team gets distracted. And right now, you're the distraction. The words stung more than Grace expected. She thanked Dana, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button with Shaw. Fingers. She had spent months learning sign language because she wanted to connect with someone she barely knew. She had rehearsed her interview answers until they felt like second nature. She had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. And now, all of it was being reduced to a rumor. The elevator doors opened and Grace stepped in, only to find Vivienne already inside, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. The older woman looked up, and her expression shifted from surprise to something softer. Leaving early? Vivienne asked. Just heading out. Long day. Vivienne studied her for a moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Grace. What's this? A note. I was going to leave it on your desk tomorrow, but since you're here... Vivienne pressed the button for the lobby and the doors slid shut. Open it when you get home. Grace looked down at the paper, her name written in Vivienne's careful hand. Why? Because I heard what they're saying about you, and I wanted you to hear it from me instead. Vivienne's voice was steady, but there was something vulnerable in the way she held her shoulders. You're not a distraction, Grace. You're the first person in a long time who made me feel like I could be honest. That's not something I want to lose to office gossip. The elevator dinged and the doors opened. Vivienne stepped out first, then paused, turning back. Also, I was wondering... She hesitated, and Grace saw the faintest flush of pink on her cheeks. Would you want to practice sign language with me sometime? Outside of work. I'm still rusty, and She stopped, as if the words were getting stuck in her throat. I want to get better. For you. For you. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and warm. Grace clutched the note to her chest and nodded. I'd like that. Vivienne smiled, that same slow-breaking ice smile Grace had seen at the end of her interview. Saturday. There's a quiet cafe on Bleecker Street. I'll text you the address. She turned and walked away, and Grace stood in the lobby, the note burning against her palm. She didn't open it until she got home, sitting on the edge of her bed with her heart pounding. The note was short, just 4 words, written in Vivienne's steady hand. I see you too. Grace read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into the drawer of her nightstand, next to the signed copy of her employment contract. Saturday couldn't come fast enough. The cafe on Bleecker Street was the kind of place that felt hidden from the world. Low amber lights, mismatched chairs, the soft hiss of an espresso machine. Grace arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a lavender latte, and chose a table by the window where she could watch the door. Vivienne walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. She wore no blazer, no heels, just a cream sweater and jeans, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Grace almost didn't recognize her. She looked softer, smaller, like a person who had stepped out of a title and into her own skin. She spotted Grace and smiled, that careful, slow-breaking smile. She ordered a black coffee and sat down across the table, her hands wrapped around the mug like she needed something to hold. "Thank you for coming," Vivienne said, her voice quieter than Grace had ever heard it. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Grace admitted. "I was nervous." "Me too." They laughed, a little awkwardly, and the tension loosened just enough for Grace to breath D. She signed. The first phrase slowly, deliberately, watching Vivienne's eyes follow her hands. "How are you?" Vivienne's lips curved. She signed back, a little clumsy but sincere. "I am better now." They practiced for nearly an hour, simple phrases at first, the weather, the cafe, the way the lavender latte tasted like honey and flowers. Then the sentences grew longer, and Grace found herself teaching Vivienne the signs for things she hadn't planned to share. Her favorite color, the name of her childhood dog, the way she took her coffee, no sugar, a splash of oat milk. Vivienne absorbed each sign like she was memorizing a language she had been waiting her whole life to learn. She asked Grace to repeat the sign for home, then practiced it 3 times, her fingers curling and uncurling with careful concentration. "Why that one?" Grace asked. Vivienne was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Because I'm not sure I know what it means anymore." The words landed like a stone in still water. Grace didn't push. She just waited, her hands resting on the table between them. Vivienne looked down at her coffee. "My sister, Elena. She was the one who taught me to sign. When we were kids, we had a neighbor who was deaf. Elena learned so she could talk to her. And then she taught me. Because she said everyone deserves to be understood." Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her lips together and blinked hard. She died 10 years ago. It was a car accident. I was the one who got the call. Vivienne's fingers traced the rim of her mug, a small, unconscious movement. I haven't signed since. I don't think I could. It felt like touching something I wasn't allowed to have anymore. Grace's chest ached. She wanted to reach across the table and take Vivienne's hand, but she didn't. Instead, she lifted her hands and signed, slowly, the way she'd learned for this exact moment. "You are allowed to be understood." Vivienne stared at her hands, then her eyes filled with tears, and she let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for years. She signed back, her movement shaky but clear. "You are the first person who made me want to try." They sat in silence for a long moment. The cafe hummed around them, but it felt like they were in their own small room of quiet. Grace didn't need to speak. She had never felt so heard in her life. Vivienne wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and laughed, a little embarrassed. "I didn't plan to do this here." "It's okay," Grace said. "You're safe." The words hung between them, simple and true. Vivienne looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, something Grace couldn't name but felt deep in her chest. "When I hired you," Vivienne said slowly, "I told myself it was because you were qualified, because you were smart and driven and you passed the interview." She paused. "But I think I was looking for a reason to say yes. I just didn't know it yet." Grace's heart stubbled. She didn't know what to say, so she signed the only thing that felt right. "I am glad you did." Vivienne's smile was small and fragile and real. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing the back of Grace's hand. Just a touch, just a second. And then she pulled away. "We should do this again," Vivienne said. Same time next week? Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked out of the cafe together into the amber light of late afternoon. The city noise rushed in around them, but Grace felt like she was still in the quiet room. Vivienne paused on the sidewalk, turned to her, thanked, and touched her own chest, then pointed at Grace, the sign for you, and held her hand there for a moment too long. Then she walked away, and Grace stood on the sidewalk, her hand pressed to her own chest, feeling the echo of that gesture long after Vivienne had disappeared around the corner. That night, Grace opened the drawer of her nightstand and looked at the note she'd tucked there a week ago. "I see you too." She ran her fingers over the words and smiled. She didn't know yet what it meant, but she knew it meant something, and for the first time in her life she was willing to wait to find out. The second Saturday arrived with a sky the color of pale honey, and Grace found herself standing outside the cafe 10 minutes early, her hands slightly damp inside her jacket pockets. She had practiced the new signs all week: coffee, warm, home, sister, remember. She had even practiced a full sentence in front of her bathroom mirror, her reflection watching her hands move with a kind of shy pride. When Vivienne appeared at the corner, Grace almost laughed. She was wearing jeans. Actual jeans, faded at the knees, with a soft gray sweater that looked like it had been washed 100 times. No blazer, no heels. Her hair was loose, and she carried 2 paper cups of coffee, one of which she held out to Grace before Grace could even say hello. "You came early," Vivienne signed, then said aloud, "I wanted to be the one waiting for once." Grace took the cup. The warmth seeped through the paper into her palms. "You remembered my order." "I remember a lot of things about you, Grace." Vivienne's voice was quiet, almost matter-of-fact, like she was stating a weather report, but her eyes held something softer, something that made Grace look down at her coffee instead of into them. Think without a destination for a while, through streets Grace had never explored, past a bookstore with cats sleeping in the window, past a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and yeast. Vivienne walked slowly, the way people do when they are not trying to get anywhere, and Grace matched her pace without thinking about it. Then Vivienne stopped in front of a small park, barely more than a strip of green between 2 brownstone buildings. There was a single bench under an old oak tree, and a fountain that had been turned off for the season, its basin full of dry leaves. Vivienne sat down on the bench and looked at the empty fountain for a long moment. "My sister used to bring me here," she said. Her voice was different, softer, younger somehow. "Every Saturday morning, when I was 8, she'd buy us both hot chocolate from that bakery we just passed, and we'd sit here while she practiced her signs with me." Grace sat down beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder through the sweater, far enough to give her space. She didn't say anything. She just waited. "She was the one who taught me the sign for home." Vivienne set her coffee down on the bench and lifted her hands. Her fingers formed the sign slowly, deliberately, as if she were unwrapping something fragile. Fingertips together, then moving to her mouth, then down to her chest. Home. She said it meant more than a building. She said it meant the place where people understand you without you having to explain. Grace watched her hands. The afternoon light filtered through the oak leaves and made patterns on Vivienne's arms. "When she died," Vivienne went on, her voice barely above a whisper, "I stopped coming here. I stopped using all of it. The signs, the memories, everything. It felt like if I couldn't think of them, I was keeping the grief too, like the only way to move forward was to leave all of it behind." She turned to look at Grace, and for a moment there was something raw and unguarded in her face. "But you know what I figured out this week? I was wrong. You don't leave grief behind, you just carry it without anyone seeing it. And that's worse." Grace's throat tightened. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that would make it better, but she knew better than to try to fix this. So she did the only thing she could think of. She lifted her hands and signed, slowly and carefully, the sentence she had practiced in her bathroom mirror all week. "You are allowed to be understood, even the sad parts." Vivienne went completely still. The only sound was the wind moving through the dry leaves in the fountain basin. Then Vivienne's face did something Grace had never seen before. Her eyes got bright, and she pressed her lips together hard, like she was holding something back. She didn't cry, but she reached out and took Grace's hand. And this time, she did not let go. Immediately, she held it, their fingers laced together, her thumb moving gently across Grace's knuckles. "You keep saying things like that," Vivienne said, her voice thick, "and I keep not knowing what to do with them." "You don't have to do anything with them," Grace said. "You just have to let them be true." Vivienne laughed, a small, broken sound. "You make it sound so simple. It is simple. It's not easy, but it's simple." They sat like that for a long time, hands laced together on the bench under the oak tree. The sun moved lower and the shadows got longer, and neither of them seemed willing to break the quiet. Finally, Vivienne spoke again. "You asked me once why I hired you, when you thought it was us just because of the sign language." Grace nodded, her heart picking up speed. "I told you I was looking for a reason to say yes. That was true, but I didn't tell you the whole truth." Vivienne turned to face her fully. "The whole truth is that I saw you in the waiting room, the day of your interview. You were reading a book, and you were smiling at something on the page, and I thought, I want to know what makes her smile like that." Grace felt her face go warm. "You hired me because I was smiling at a book?" "No." Vivienne's voice was low and certain. "I hired you because I wanted to be the reason for that smile, and I still do." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. Grace could feel her own pulse in her throat, and she could see the same tension in the way Vivienne's shoulders had gone still, like she was braced for rejection. Grace lifted her free hand and signed, one sign at a time, the sentence she had been too afraid to say out loud. "I want that too." Vivienne let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. And then she smiled, a real smile, open and unguarded, and Grace realized she had never seen Vivienne's whole face before. She had seen the CEO, the guarded woman, the careful stranger, but this was Vivienne, the person, and she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with power. They walked back toward the cafe as the streetlights came on, still holding hands, not ready to let go. When they reached the corner where they had parted last week, Vivienne paused and turned to her. "Same time next Saturday?" she asked, but she said it like a promise, not a question. Grace nodded then. Before she could overthink it, she lifted her hand and touched her own chest, then pointed at Vivienne. "The sign for you." She held her hand there for a moment too long, echoing what Vivienne had done to her a week ago. Vivienne's eyes went soft. "You're learning fast. I had a good teacher." Vivienne squeezed her hand one last time and let go. And as Grace watched her walk away into the amber glow of the streetlights, she realized that she was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was already happening. She just had to be brave enough to let it. The next Saturday, Grace found Vivienne already sitting on their bench, hands folded in her lap, staring at the fountain. She looked like she had been there for a long time. Grace sat down beside her without a word. She had learned over the past weeks that sometimes the best thing she could offer was her presence, not her questions. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The park was quiet, the late October air carrying the smell of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. Then Vivienne said very quietly, "She didn't die in a hospital." Grace turned to face her, waiting. "She died on the highway. A truck crossed the median. The police said it was instant." Vivienne's voice was flat, careful, like she was reading a report instead of remembering her sister's death. "I was supposed to be in that car." Grace felt her own breath catch. "I was 17. She was driving me to a college tour. I had just gotten my license and I wanted to drive. But she said no. She wanted to take the highway route because it was faster." Vivienne pressed her fingers against her own knee hard. "I got angry. I said something mean. I told her she was controlling, that she always had to be in charge of everything." She stopped, her jaw tightened. "The last thing I ever said to my sister was that she was too bossy." And then she turned to look at me, to argue back, and she didn't say, "Think the truck." The words hung in the air like frost. Grace reached out and took Vivienne's hand. She didn't sign anything. She didn't say anything. She just held on, the way Vivienne had held her hand that first time in the rain. "That's why I stopped signing," Vivienne whispered. "Every time I moved my hands, I could hear her voice. I could hear myself being cruel. And I thought if I never signed again, maybe I could pretend she wasn't gone. Maybe I could pretend I hadn't said it." Grace's throat ached. She kept her grip steady. "The assistant before you," Vivienne said, her voice breaking for the first time. "She asked me about the photos in my office, the ones of Elena and me, and I couldn't answer her. So I fired her. I told myself she was too nosy, that she overstepped. Really, I was just terrified that someone would see the whole ugly truth and realize how broken I am. You're not broken, Grace said out loud, her voice thick. Vivienne looked at her with wet eyes. You don't know that. I do. Grace let go of her hand and began to sign, slowly and deliberately, the way Vivienne had taught her. You carried this alone for 10 years. You built a company that helps people. You learned to be kind again, even though someone you loved taught you that kindness was dangerous. She paused, then signed the most important part. You are allowed to be understood. Even the sad parts, especially the sad parts. Vivienne let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You said that before. I meant it before. I mean it more now. Vivienne wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I've never told anyone about that day. Not my therapist, not my parents, just you. Why me? Because you looked at me like I was worth understanding. Vivienne's voice cracked on this last word. That first day in the waiting room, you were reading that book with the red cover and you smiled at something in it. And I thought, I want to be the reason she smiles like that. I want to be the person who makes her look at the world like it's still worth loving. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. So I hired you, Vivienne said. Not because you were the most qualified, because you were the one I wanted to come home to. The words settled between them like the first snowfall of winter. Grace stood up. Then she knelt in front of Vivienne, took both of her hands, and signed, one word at a time, with her whole body leaning in. I am not waiting anymore. Vivienne stared at her, breathless. Grace signed again, slower, letting every movement carry the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had felt, everything she had been too afraid to say until now. I love you. Not because you're powerful, not because you hired me, because you showed me your scarred places and trusted me not to run. Vivienne's face crumpled. She reached out and pulled Grace into her arms, burying her face in Grace's shoulder. She didn't cry loudly. She just held on, shaking, while Grace wrapped her arms around her and whispered into her hair, I've got you. I've got you. They stayed like that until the fountain lights came on, casting soft blue ripples across the water. When Vivienne finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear. I love you too, she said, her voice raw and honest. I think I've loved you since before I knew your name. Grace laughed, a wet, relieved sound. That's a terrible line. It's true. I know. Grace took her hand again and kissed the back of it, a soft, deliberate gesture. I know. Vivienne smiled, real, smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and softened every sharp edge of her face. Same time next Saturday? Grace asked, using Vivienne's own words from the week before. Same time every Saturday, Vivienne said. For as long as you'll have me. Grace squeezed her hand and stood, pulling Vivienne up with her. They walked toward the cafe hand in hand, their steps matching, their silence comfortable. And for the first time in 10 years, Vivienne didn't feel the weight of her sister's ghost dragging her down. She felt it walking beside her, warm and patient, finally at peace. The first Saturday in June was warm and unhurried, the kind of morning that felt like a held breath finally released. Grace arrived at Vivienne's apartment with a paper bag of pastries and a small pot of lavender she had grown on her own windowsill, and Vivienne opened the door in bare feet and an old sweater that had once belonged to her sister. She didn't apologize for it, she simply stepped aside and let Grace in. They ate breakfast on the balcony, the city humming below them. Vivienne's phone buzzed twice with work emails, and Grace reached over and turned it face down without a word. Vivienne watched her do it, something soft and wondering passing through her eyes. You know, Vivienne said, when I first interviewed you, my phone did the same thing. You didn't flinch. You didn't even glance at it. She paused. I think that was the moment I knew you were different. Grace tilted her head. I thought you were testing my patience. I was, Vivienne smiled. And you passed without even knowing there was a test. They stayed like that for a while, the silence easy now instead of watchful. Then Vivienne set down her coffee cup and looked at Grace with a rare, open expression. "I want to show you something," she said. "It's not far, but I need you to know. I've never shown anyone this, not my parents, not any friend, just me." Grace set down her pastry and nodded slowly. "Then I'm honored you'd want to." Vivienne drove them to a small cemetery on the edge of the city, tucked behind an old stone church. The grass was green and well kept, and the headstones were modest, leaning slightly with age. She parked and sat still for a long moment, both hands on the wheel. "I haven't been here since the funeral," she said quietly. "I told myself it was because I was too busy. But really, I was afraid that if I came here, I'd have to admit she was really gone. And if I admitted that, I'd have to admit it was my fault." Grace reached over and placed her hand over Vivienne's. She didn't say anything. She just waited. Vivienne got out of the car and Grace followed. They walked between the rows of headstones until Vivienne stopped in front of a simple gray marker. The name read, Elena M.A.S.C.R.D., and beneath it, a single line, "Beloved daughter and sister." Vivienne stood very still, her shoulders tight. Grace moved to stand beside her, close enough that their elbows touched, and signed slowly, deliberately, "I'm here." Vivienne let out a shaky breath and knelt down in the grass. She touched the letters of her sister's name with her fingertips, tracing them like braille. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I said horrible things. I've carried them with every single day. And I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know I'm not carrying them alone anymore." A breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves. Vivienne closed her eyes and let it wash over her. Then she felt Grace kneel down beside her, felt the warmth of her hand on her shoulder. Grace didn't sign anything elaborate. She just sat there, present and steady, a quiet witness to a decade of grief finally being laid down. After a long moment, Vivienne opened her eyes and looked at Grace. Her face was wet, but her smile was real. "Thank you," she said, "for learning my language, for not giving up on me, for dailing." Grace's eyes were bright. "I'd learn 1,000 languages just to say one sentence to you." "Which sentence?" Grace signed it, slow and clear. "You are home." Vivienne laughed, a small, broken sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't quite a sob either. She reached out and pulled Grace into a hug, right there in front of her sister's grave, holding her like she was the only solid thing in the world. They stayed at the cemetery until the sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter. Before they left, Vivienne took a small red book out of her coat pocket, the same one she had carried to every Saturday meeting, and set it gently at the base of Elena's headstone. "That's my journal," she said, answering Grace's unspoken question. "I wrote in it every week for 10 years, about work, about the weather, about how I couldn't forgive myself. But the last page is about you." She paused. "I think she would have liked you." Grace took her hand. "I think she would have been proud of you." Vivienne squeezed her fingers and didn't let go. Back at the apartment, Grace helped her sort through a box of old photographs that Vivienne had kept sealed in the closet for years. They found pictures of Elena at a high school dance, Elena at a graduation, Elena and Vivienne as children, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something the camera couldn't capture. "She had a good smile," Grace said. "She did." Vivienne traced the edge of one photograph, then placed it carefully back in the box. "I'm going to frame some of these. Put them on the mantel. Let her be part of the house again." Grace looked at her, at the quiet resolve in her face, and felt something warm and certain settle in her chest. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said, her tone lighter now. Vivienne raised an eyebrow.
"You've been asking me things all morning." "Not like this." Grace set down the photograph she was holding and took both of Vivienne's hands in hers. "Do you still want to be my boss?" Vivienne blinked, then laughed. "Honestly? No. I've been thinking about it. I think I'd rather have you as my girlfriend than my assistant." "Good," Grace said. "Because I've already sent my resignation letter to HR." "You... what?" "I signed it this morning." Grace smiled, slow and teasing. "I figured I'd give you the courtesy of telling you before it hit your inbox." Vivienne stared at her for a second. then pulled her close, laughing into her hair. "You're impossible." "You love it." "I do." Vivienne pulled back just enough to look at her. "I really do." They stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by photographs and shared history and the quiet promise of everything still to come. Outside, the city moved on, loud and indifferent. But in here, in this small space that was slowly becoming theirs, time felt different. Kind. Almost. That evening, as the sun set and the apartment grew dim, Grace taught Vivienne a new sign. She spelled it out slowly, then showed her the full gesture. Home. Vivienne repeated it, her hands remembering the shape of it from a lesson long ago, and then signed it back to Grace without hesitation. Grace smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Welcome home," she said. And Vivienne, for the first time in her life, believed she had one.
I learned a few signs just to survive an interview, but I ended up finding my home in the one person who truly saw me. Sometimes, the deepest kind of love happens in complete silence. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching our story from? Tell me in the comments below.